The last flight. Prologue, 23 meters to the edge. Under a heavy gray sky, the Pelican 9, an amphibious float plane, emerges from the dense curtain of rain, its propellers spinning furiously, slicing through wind and water spray. Below, the sea rages, dark, enraged. Ahead lies a steel flight deck rocking on the waves. This is not an airbase. This is a hospital ship, humanity's last hope. The plane flies low, dangerously low. The pilot, a man around 50, unshaven, his face weathered like the airframe he commands, is tense. His movements are precise, almost mechanical. He grips the controls like an old sailor, that special tension reserved for the instant between life and death. On the deck below, a thin film of water glistens. Crewmen and slickers scramble, stepping back to clear the way. Someone tosses a safety net aside, a final lifeline, in case the brakes fail. The Pelican touches down with a harsh jolt. Its landing gear screeches, water sprays in every direction. The plane begins to brake, yet the deck is slick and the rain intensifies. It veers to one side. The tail whips out. The aircraft skids, shrieking across metal as if protesting the very notion of stopping. 23 meters remain. 18, 16, 20. The nose fairing hovers over empty space, the deck's edge just ahead, beyond which lies only sea. The propeller still spins. One more push, and it will plunge downward. But it does not. The plane shudders on the brink. So does its pilot, this man who can no longer hide from himself. He has survived. He has arrived. He has made the impossible happen. Rescue crews surge onto the deck, and everything is only just beginning. Chapter 1, Quiet Life After the Storm. Elias Mercer woke every day at exactly the same moment, 1 minute before his alarm, even though the alarm no longer worked. The clock in the corner of the kitchen had stopped, as if it too were too weary to keep going. But he never wound it. Everything in the house felt slightly askew, worn down by time, yet reliable, much like himself. After what had happened on the mainland, hospital orders, funeral wreaths, he chose silence. San Vicente, an archipelago in the South Atlantic where mail arrives only once every 2 weeks, and the radio picks up a single station, and only when the wind blows just right. His house stood on an eastern slope, and each morning sunlight carved shadows into stripes. Elias sipped coffee brewed on a kerosene stove, gazing out at the bay where his plane, Pelican 9, waited at the dock. He had spent long evenings restoring it, at first just to keep his hands busy. Then he realized he knew every rivet like an old scar. The Pelican was no longer transport, it was a partner. He carried medicine, letters, and occasionally passengers. Short flights between islands, no conversation, no delays. They called him Doc, though technically he was no longer a medic, since refusing to sign a document that would have covered someone else's mistake, everything became simpler. No more oaths. Only the sky and the propeller. Every week he flew to Cantara, Los Migueles, Faruela. He knew the terrain, the winds, the hidden currents. He flew low, almost skimming the waves. He didn't chase schedules. He simply could not stop flying. Sometimes he caught himself looking at children, offering a stray smile. Recently in Los Migueles, he gave a boy a mint candy. He never would have done that before. Something had shifted. He wasn't seeking these small moments. He merely refrained from looking away. He washed his morning cup by hand. He did so every day, not because there was no dishwasher, but because he knew exactly how long each drop would take. It was his way of controlling what he still could. The Pelican's landing gear sagged slightly on the left side. Elias had wedged a scrap of an old crate under the strut. Each time he promised himself he'd fix it. Each time he postponed. The plane, like him, held itself up by habit rather than instruction. Lilies bloomed again in the yard. He hadn't planted them for 3 years, yet they returned as if they remembered something. When the first thunderstorm of the season rolled in one evening, he did not flinch. He simply stood on the veranda with his cup. A storm was no longer a trigger. It was just part of the weather. In a past life, he would have checked the radio antenna, packed an emergency kit, plotted coordinates. Now he simply waited for it to pass. That day was like any other. The Pelican went through its pre-flight inspection, cylinders in good order, though the left engine was burning oil faster than usual. He loaded vaccine vials, letters, radio parts. No passengers, and that was better. The sky was clear, save for a band of thick clouds to the southeast. He lifted off without effort. The atmosphere pressed on the wings. They were at working density. The flight proceeded calmly. On the second island, children awaited him. They ran onto the airstrip, calling his nickname. He handed out sweets, then flew on without a word. But that time, as he secured his cargo, he noticed something on the horizon. A line. Not a cloud. Something dense. Black. The wind shifted. By his calculations, he had enough time to clear the front if he departed immediately. He started the engine without waiting for the children to disperse and climbed into the sky, toward where the thin line between the familiar and what once changed everything again began to form. It was an ordinary day, and yet when he started the engine, shorebirds near the beach rose as one, and somewhere in his chest he felt a prick, as though someone were watching him from the future. Chapter 2. A Voice from Nowhere. By midday, Elias had crossed the third island on his route and headed further south. The cockpit was hot and cramped. The propeller droned steadily yet loudly, and the sun beat down through the windshield so fiercely that he had to squint. At times like this, flying became almost automatic. Familiar gestures, glances at the instruments, small course corrections. Below him, the ocean stretched deep blue and calm, without a single whitecap. Only sometimes, far off at the horizon, did patches of clouds drift by. Everything looked serene, and that was precisely what unsettled him. He checked the radio frequencies. Normally, this area was silent. No ships, no emergencies, no inter-island chatter, only a faint hiss broken by atmospheric crackles. But at that moment, he caught something strange, an indistinct fragment of speech, as if someone were talking through a thick veil of water. He raised the volume. The noise intensified as if a gust of wind had entered the cockpit, but through the static, words emerged. They were broken, unintelligible. He fine-tuned the receiver manually. The static subsided just enough, and in the next second he heard something that made him straighten in his seat. It was a distress signal. Someone was calling for help. Pause. Then another phrase. Ship. Damaged. Children. Waves. Storm. Elias removed one hand from the controls to start recording, even as he kept listening and watching his navigator for coordinates. There was no doubt. A private vessel, apparently a small boat, had struck a reef. The water was rising. Their radio was damaged. On board were 2 adults and 2 children. He eased back on the throttle, descended to 2,000 feet, and began to calculate their position. They were roughly 200 nautical miles from his current location, due southeast, where the horizon already darkened and clouds merged into one solid haze. He ran the numbers in his head. The nearest coastal rescue station was at least 400 miles away, too far for an immediate response. If the coordinates were correct, the survivors were directly in the path of an incoming storm. Under those conditions, rescue crews wouldn't even attempt to fly. Their communications were almost non-functional, and when the signal cut off completely, he understood there would be no further transmissions. He glanced at the fuel gauge. There was just enough fuel to reach the distress coordinates, but not enough to return. No islands lay within a safe landing radius, only water, and one point on his navigation chart he hadn't marked in many years. The position of the Salacia, the hospital ship, temporarily deployed to the region for exercises, once assigned to it, once left it without saying goodbye. Elias paused for a moment. He knew what returning there would mean. They might still remember him, or worse, not remember him at all. But behind that choice echoed a child's voice, high, frightened. The last words he heard, "Please, he's scared." He did not hesitate. He yanked the yoke and veered the plane off his usual route, steering it toward the distress coordinates. Below him, the ocean's surface lay flat, except where a gray, heavy, living presence rose at the edge, a storm advancing like a creature from the deep. He activated the emergency transmitter and logged his current course. Now he flew blind, guided only by the last-second coordinates, calculations based on faith, and a plan that bordered on madness. He knew the chances of finding a life raft were vanishingly small. The storm would shift its position. Waves would engulf it. Navigation would fail. But if he didn't try, everything would end, and no one would ever know. A family would vanish as countless yachts do thousands of miles from the mainland, without a trace. Elias advanced the throttle. The plane answered with a roar. He didn't know how much time he had, but he knew this borrowed time would run out far sooner than his own. So he flew, for the first time in many years, not away from something, but toward something. Chapter 3. Return to the Ghosts. The storm loomed before him like a massive wall, steadily closing in. Clouds fused into a single, solid expanse, punctured only by sporadic flashes of light. The air grew heavier. The Pelican's engine strained against the building headwind. Elias gripped the controls firmly. He had encountered many storms over the years, but this one felt personal, as if the very weather were testing his resolve. Through a narrow break beneath his wing, he glimpsed the ocean's surface. Swollen, torn, white with foam. He descended to 1,000 feet, exposing the plane to turbulence, and began a search pattern in a zigzag. Gusts tossed the aircraft from side to side. Each turn demanded effort, yet he persisted. The first 20 minutes yielded nothing but noise and chaos, reality outside the window, losing all shape. He could barely see the horizon. The line between sky and sea had dissolved, and still he did not retreat. On the third leg, in a break between wave crests, he spotted something unnaturally bright, a flash of orange amid the gray-green storm. He altered course sharply, banking steeply, and caught sight of it again. Round, glowing, alive. A life raft. It bobbed up, surfacing on a wave, then vanished into the trough. A small spot of life in a featureless ocean. He descended even lower, almost to 500 feet. The turbulence became nearly unbearable. The windows blurred with rain. The canopy threatened to crack under wind. Inside the raft, he made out 4 figures, 2 adults and 2 children. One child waved. They were alive. Landing was impossible. No aircraft in the world could touch down on waves like these. He opened the emergency kit, activated the GPS beacon, set it to transmit continuously, and tossed it out the window. Next to it, he flung a signal flare. Despite the rain, the flare ignited. Its red flame cut through the darkness. Below, someone raised an arm. They saw him. They knew he was there. Yet that alone would not suffice. An evacuation was imperative, and communication was virtually non-existent. He checked the fuel gauge. Less than half remained. It was too late to return. The only place he could reach was the former hospital ship Salacia. He quickly consulted his navigation. The coordinates matched. It was about 150 miles away. He could make it, but it still might not be enough. The civilian frequency didn't go through. He switched to the old military channel. His hand trembled before he pressed the button. He had no right. He left that system long ago, because once everything went wrong. 15 years earlier on that very ship, he was the last person to see alive the medical detachment's commander. His decision then was hasty. He believed he was saving lives, but someone else could have saved them. And the hearings afterward, the evacuation, the reports, the funeral proved as much. Now he headed back there, not as a serviceman, not as a doctor, not as an officer, but as a man clinging to a final hope. He keyed the microphone, gave his call sign and coordinates. Silence filled the airwaves tortuously long before someone answered. He recognized the tone, tight, military, reserved. He was ordered to stand down. He relayed the raft's coordinates and urged them to act quickly. The response was a formal refusal, doubt, and a threat to intercept. He understood. They either didn't believe him or remembered him too well. He paused, gathered himself, uttered his full name, reported his former rank. Silence fell again. He imagined someone checking lists, recalling old documents, names, tragedies. Then the voice changed. He recognized it. The voice of Captain Thomas Kiner, the same man who 15 years ago removed him from duty. He didn't ask questions. He simply asked if Elias believed he could land on their deck in such weather, without preparation, without a tailhook. Elias answered that it wasn't about him, it was about them. The line crackled, went dead, then came back to life. A minute later, the reply: they would clear the deck. He would get one chance. 40 minutes later, the ship appeared on the horizon, an immense gray silhouette among the waves, growing fast, too fast. The wind strengthened. Waves began smashing against the hull. The deck pitched and heaved as if breathing in concert with the sea. He entered the glide. Only one thought occupied his mind. Do not err. Do not repeat the past. Do not destroy. He descended. The Pelican trembled from bow to stern. Water licked at the landing gear. He waited for the right moment, then released the brakes. Contact with the deck was sharp but direct. The plane slewed. The landing gear squealed as steel scraped steel. He felt the wheels lose traction. The nose swung sideways. The propeller sliced spray into the gusty air. Then, a collision. The plane struck the safety net. It spun around and came to rest. Its nose hung over the deck's edge, beyond which foamy water roiled. Elias sat motionless. Inside the cockpit, a hush enveloped the instruments droning. He could not feel his fingers. His heart pounded at his temples. But he knew. He was once again on board. He was among those who could help. And now everything depended on them. He had done the impossible. All that remained was to see if they would arrive in time. Chapter 4. Contact with the Past. When the cockpit hatch swung open, salty wind lashed Elias's face, mixing the scent of rain, aviation fuel, and sea foam. He climbed out, legs numb, stepping onto the deck's wet metal. For the first time in years, he was aboard a military ship. But everything felt different now. Instead of confidence, there was a quiet tension. Instead of belonging, an uncanny sense that he'd intruded somewhere he was no longer expected. Figures in slickers and helmets bustled around him, some in crisp yellow and blue high-visibility vests. One person stood at the deck's edge, guiding the braking procedure. Others manned a crane or watched from an observation platform. All eyes were on him. Few looked directly, some with professional restraint, accustomed to everything. Others warily, as if they recognized him. Only one gaze, still and unwavering, met his from the edge of the group. On the upper deck stood Captain Thomas Kiner, in his early 50s now, trim, with almost the same expression he'd worn 15 years ago. The man who once pulled him from duty, signed his suspension, yet refrained from finishing him off. He watched silently as Elias approached. Between them lay sea, years, guilt, fragments of unspoken words. But now none of that mattered. Elias gave a brief formal salute. Kiner did not reply at once. He took a step forward. For a brief moment, something like recognition flickered in his expression. Perhaps he understood why Elias was here. Perhaps he had heard that recorded distress call. Or with a practiced eye, he simply saw by Elias's face that this was no pose. There was no need for words. The captain turned and led him inside the ship. They passed a damp gangway, past equipment, muffled voices, and numbered bulkhead signs. Everything was familiar and yet alien. New charts and orders hung on the walls. Young faces in the corridor darted quick glances. Some might not have known who he was. Others remembered and judged him silently. In the medical center, organized urgency reigned. Preliminary data had already arrived. The raft's coordinates, last known position, weather conditions, drift calculations. Elias saw on a screen the plot he himself had marked, and realized, now everything hinged on them. Would they act faster than the sea swallowed that raft? A helicopter was being readied for takeoff. The rescue team gathered in minutes. Some checked gear, others pored over maps. The navigator shot Elias a curt glance, as if asking him to confirm the figures. He nodded wordlessly. Over years away, he lost rank, position, uniform, but not the skill of precise calculation, of listening to the wind, of discerning patterns in chaos. In this ship, with this crew, something still resonated at his presence. When the helicopter lifted from the deck, Elias stood by a porthole. The display showed the approach to the target. He barely breathed. Every minute stretched taut as a cable over an abyss. He did not hear the conversation in the room. He did not notice officers discussing flight paths. Inside him, a clock counted down. Then, a faint signal, visual confirmation. The life raft was found. Water flooded its side. One child had lost consciousness. Evacuation began immediately. One by one, they hoisted them into the rescue basket, wet but alive. On the screen, their shadows flickered as they grasped the cables. At that moment, something in Elias's chest tightened, not from relief but from realization. He had done what he did not expect ever to do. When the team returned, he remained in the shadows. He did not step forward to meet those he saved. He watched from around the corner as medics wrapped blankets around the children, inserted IV lines, and parents clutched them as if afraid they might vanish again. He knew he would remember their faces forever, yet no words were necessary. Kiner approached again. He made no gesture. He simply stood beside Elias. For a moment they silently gazed toward the hangar. Perhaps Kiner wanted to speak, but this time there was no need. Work had passed between them. It was complete. That evening, when the storm receded and the sea calmed, a young pilot handed Elias an envelope. Inside lay an unsigned note, coordinates, clearance to depart, and a flight plan. And a small box, old, metal, slightly worn. Inside was a medal for bravery in the line of duty. The very medal he should have received 15 years ago. Then it was never awarded. Now they left it wordlessly, without fanfare. Elias did not hide it. He placed the box in his breast pocket as if something lost had returned home. The next morning he boarded the deck. The plane was ready. Crew in the hangar aided his inspection, inflating tires, checking oil. Nobody asked questions. As he walked toward the cockpit, wind tugged at his sleeves, and sunlight shone once more. He did not look back. The ghosts remained behind, this time forever. Chapter 5. 4 Silhouettes Against the Sky. On the hospital ship's deck reigned a rare atmosphere, not peace, but a temporary ease. Everyone involved in the last rescue operation dispersed to their compartments, trading salt and adrenaline-soaked hours for routine and calm. Elias stood at the very edge, leaning against the cold metal railing. The sea stretched out in full force, flat as steel, with only occasional whitecaps. Behind him in the hangar, crew prepared his plane for departure. They awaited him on San Vicente, his roots, medical supplies, and perhaps one of the children who once asked for a mint candy. He gazed at the helicopter landing pad where the survivors stood under the sun. A woman, a man, and 2 children. Medics bustled around them, checking pulses and breathing. The little girl who had waved at him from the raft spotted him. She simply looked intently for a long moment, as if confirming, "Is this really him?" He did not respond, but stayed until she looked away. When they flew off, the helicopter shrinking to a speck against the clouds, Elias returned to the hangar. The chief mechanic was inspecting the Pelican 9. The plane was ready, inspection passed, tanks refilled. Elias ran his hand along the wing as if patting an old friend's shoulder. He climbed into the cockpit and powered up the instruments. The engine started on the first attempt. He requested takeoff clearance and received it. The plane taxied slowly to the deck's edge. Elias leveled it, paused for a second, and took a deep breath. Inside him, no weight, no tension. Only a calm, steady feeling, like emerging onto smooth water after traversing a stormy sea. He glanced at the sky, where clouds were breaking apart, and for the first time in a long while, did not try to forget anything. He simply breathed. Chapter 6. Wind from the East. Morning arrived without fanfare. The air felt dense and humid, as it often did in the open ocean after a storm. Early sunlight filtered through a light haze, reflecting off the ship's superstructure in amber hues. Elias Mercer, pilot with a face etched by time and salt, was already on his feet, inspecting his battle-worn Pelican 9. The plane looked battered but whole, much like its owner. They both had survived more than they should have. Mechanics in protective overalls worked in unison, checking landing gear struts and airframe fastenings. One of them quietly whistled a tune, as though the entire morning were nothing but routine. Elias watched them distantly. His thoughts still lingered in that sky, during the harrowing minutes of approach when he knew there would be no second chance. An odd quiet settled inside him, as if something important had ended without leaving an empty void. Only a steady, heavy breath. Life went on. The ship pulsed with its own rhythm. From below decks, officers emerged, Watch shifts changed. Diesel generators hummed. On the deck, someone did morning calisthenics. From the helicopter, they unloaded jerry cans and crates, medical supplies, food, water. All of it went deeper into the ship to those who had been rescued. Elias could not see them, but he knew the children were alive. That knowledge was enough. Passing the hangar, he glimpsed one of the girls wrapped in a blanket, offering a candy to her younger brother. They sat on the floor, crafting something from packaging and bandages. The girl looked at him, and unlike the old Elias, he did not look away. He stopped, nodded to her. She nodded back. He caught himself thinking, previously he would have walked right past. Now, he did not. A faint smile tugged at his lips. A junior lieutenant approached, holding a small transparent envelope. Without a word, he handed it to Elias, and after a brief nod, walked away. Inside lay a piece of paper with a child's palm print and a short message written in large letters. "You were there." Elias stared at it for a long moment, then folded it carefully and placed it into his jacket pocket, where he usually kept his navigation charts. The gesture was simple but piercing. It held no symbolism, only the fact that someone saw him and remembered. When the mechanical inspection finished, the mechanics gave the green light. The propeller began to spin as though yesterday's insanity never happened. The ship turned, creating a following breeze to give the plane an easier lift. Elias warmed up the engine, cast one last glance at the deck, and nodded to himself. This time, everything followed protocol. He was not saving anyone, not running from the past. He was simply leaving. The plane, like a bird, lifted and easily rose from the deck. The metal hull vibrated in the headwind, but Elias felt no anxiety. He knew every vibration, every sound, and this time they all sounded even. Neither engine faltered. The ship receded beneath him, shrinking to a gray speck against the ocean. Yet it remained more than just a point on the map. Now it stood as part of something greater, a symbol of a choice made not from fear, but from dignity. At 3,000 feet, he turned the plane northwest toward Faroe Island, where his weekly medical deliveries awaited. Below, reefs sparkled like jewels set in water. His gaze no longer held detachment. This was not an escape. This was forward movement. He recalled that Captain Kiner, after hearing his plea, did not immediately grant permission to land, but he did. Not out of trust, but out of duty. Yet after the rescue, after survival, Kiner sent him not a medal or pardon, but simply clearance to depart without further checks. That was his gesture, without words. They understood each other. When the distant thunder of a new storm moving in from the east reached the cockpit, Elias did not tense. He did not immediately switch on the scanners or recalculate escape routes. He simply looked toward the merging clouds and aligned his course. The wind trailed behind him, not threatening, not pushing, more like an escort. Epilogue, the storm subsides. Morning was quiet. No alarms, no loud voices. Only the rustle of the wind, the faint creak of a rope, and muted footsteps on the wet deck. The ship lay at anchor in the bay. The water around it was as smooth as glass. Over the horizon, the sun rose, casting warm light on the superstructure, still bearing the scars of a recent storm. Elias sat in the maintenance room, hunched over a toolbox. His movements were unhurried as he sifted through tools one by one. Screwdrivers, sensors, an old folding ruler, and a nearly forgotten notebook of route notes. At the bottom lay a small case, black, with chipped edges. He looked at it without opening it. He merely held it in his hands, then gently placed it in another lockbox. Not to hide it, more to let it go. From the hangar came laughter, children's laughter, the very ones pulled from the storm's tight grip. One boy raced around with a plywood model plane. Another drew on a scrap of packing cardboard. One of the medics approached Elias and wordlessly handed him a sheet of paper, a drawing of a plane flying above the sea, accompanied by the words, "You were the sky." Elias took the drawing, studied the crude lines and solemn faces sketched with childish seriousness. He did not hang it on the wall. He simply placed it in the same box that held the logbook, as a part of his route, as proof that someone saw and remembered. When his plane was ready, he climbed into the cockpit, without hurry, without tension. Everything followed procedure. The engine started on the first try, without a sputter. The air felt light, untainted by fear as it once was. He did not feel that he was leaving. Rather, he felt as though he was returning. From high above, the ship shrank to something tiny, like a memory. The sea lay calm, more so than it had been in a long time. On the navigation screen, a new flight path lit up, northward along the coastline, toward places that had always required attention, but where he had never flown before. The wind blew at his back. Below his course lay emptiness, and that was good. He did not look back, and there was no need to. The storm had subsided, and he remained.